Welcome to TYT Interviews. Our interview today is a personal indulgence of mine, but it's going to be interesting to everybody. I have the honor of talking to somebody about Bolivia and cooperative mining in Bolivia. Our interview subject today is Andrea Marston, studying for her PhD in geography at the University of California-Berkeley. And her field of study right now is the Bolivian mining cooperatives, and we're going to get into that and explain what that's all about. Andrea, welcome to TYT Interviews.
First of all, thank you for having me here, Dave. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm actually just in the geography department at Berkeley, and my research is looking at the history and politics of what are called mining cooperatives in Bolivia. And I'm currently based in Bolivia right now, which is why I couldn't be in the studio with you today. So I'm Skyping in from La Paz.
Well, I'm envious. I'm excited. By the end of the interview, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about your personal experiences in Bolivia. But for now, what are these Bolivian mining cooperatives?
Well, the thing that has to be really emphasized to begin with is that mining cooperatives are not actually cooperatively organized in any way that you and I, or probably most of the viewers, would recognize as cooperative. And by what I mean by that is that there's no redistribution of profit at the end of the day. So although these are groups of independent miners who collectively hold legal rights to the subsoil, so they collectively hold concessions, they basically divide up the whole mountain or whatever work area that they have between all their members. So then it's up to the individual luck of a miner, or sometimes a small group of miners, to go in there and find a wealthy vein of mineral or a deposit of ore that can then be extracted, processed, and taken to market by that miner, him or her, but mostly himself. And at the end of the day, this isn't redistributed across the whole cooperative. What that means is that some miners within the same cooperative can get very wealthy, while the next door neighbor, so to speak, underground in the same cooperative is making virtually no money, working in pretty appalling conditions for decades at a time. And in some mining cooperatives, some of the people who have grown wealthy, who have got lucky by hitting a good vein or just having had access to a more lucrative part of the deposit to begin with, are actually able to subcontract that labor to other workers. So you get these situations where a mining cooperative member is actually employing a small group of laborers who aren't members of the mining cooperative, usually at very low wages. And this creates a situation that in Bolivia is called a patron relationship, which loosely translates as bosses, but has a much more authoritarian connotation to it. So you essentially get these bosses or patrones who are employing workers for very meager wages. But I really want to emphasize that that's not all mining cooperatives. In others that don't have as much access to good mineral structures, or who the mineral they exploit has lower prices, don't have that situation. It ends up almost being more like an underground family farm situation where everyone has their own small areas that they work, often in conjunction with family members or friends. But again, the wealth is not distributed across the whole cooperative.
So what is the historical background of this? Why are these, first of all, what area of Bolivia and what kind of metal are we talking about? These cooperatives, which aren't really cooperatives, what are they mining?
Everything. I mean, in Bolivia, the three main ones, or I guess I should say the four main ones, are silver, tin, zinc, and gold, with zinc being not as much as the other three. But there are also smaller ones of tungsten and basically any other metal that you can find. The historical background of these cooperatives is absolutely related to the boom-bust cycle of the mineral market over the last 100 years and foreign policy, coming mostly from the U.S., to be honest, in two distinct moments. And so the first mining cooperative in Bolivia, which is a silver cooperative, was created in the 30s, basically just a lot of laid-off miners post-economic crisis who banded together and started to exploit an abandoned mine, and then they sold that mineral back to the company that had previously been employing them. But that's kind of an outlier historically. The others, and there are many of them in Bolivia, they're about, I think they're around 1,500 mining cooperatives at this point, with a membership of around 121,000 total registered cooperative members. And they were created in about 3 distinct waves that I kind of think of as the Cold War wave, the 1960s, the neoliberal wave, the 1980s, and the commodity boom wave just recently. And I can get into more or less detail with each of these waves, but just to put a really quick gloss on what was going on, in the 1960s, it was part of a series of loans that was given to the Bolivian government through what was called the Triangular Plan. And this is in a context where U.S. foreign policy in Latin America was very much geared towards preventing another revolution of the Cuban variety. Mm-hmm. And Bolivia was the most risky country from an American perspective because of the very militantly organized Marxist and Trotskyist miners' unions. So this was a plan to lay off large amounts of miners, but then to give them their own concessions to work any way they wanted. They could self-organize into cooperatives that would then decrease political pressure on the government in the absence of salaried jobs. And this happened, again, basically the exact same thing, but on a more massive level in the neoliberal era in the 1980s, when the tin market essentially collapsed. Whole series of austerity measures were launched by the Bolivian government that included the complete dismantling of the National Mining Corporation. And this involved the layoff of some between 20 and 30,000 miners that then were given their own areas to work and transformed into cooperatives. And this is really the point in history that people usually point to understand the history of the cooperatives. But they didn't really reach national level prominence until much more recently just in the last decade with commodity boom, prices going haywire. Tons of people in Bolivia who hadn't previously had anything to do with mining started entering the cooperative sphere and either joining pre-existing cooperatives or setting up their own. And this is really the gold cooperative moment. Tons of cooperatives looking at gold were created. In Bolivia, it's traditionally been a silver and tin mining country, so gold was relatively new. And a lot of these people had more money to invest. So what they did was they just banded together with their friends, sometimes either professionals in the cities, doctors, lawyers, and they got a mining concession that they then hired other people to work for them, but still under the label of mining cooperative.
Okay, we're going to get to the current day, but I was fascinated to hear what you were saying about the Cold War era when it was a partially U.S.-inspired plan to reduce the pressure on the government. So when these cooperatives, would it be fair to say that back in the 60s they were imposed on the miners? Were the miners, let's say, cooperative in joining these cooperatives? Or did they resist?
Well, there was a lot of resistance to the dismantling of the National Mining Corporation that was taking place at that time. And you have to keep in mind with this that Bolivia had a revolution in 1952 that was incredibly important and that nationalized the whole mining industry and created this National Mining Corporation, Comibol. So the Triangular Plan the U.S. was funding was a way of just partially dismantling that national corporation. Mm-hmm. And so absolutely the miners resisted. They were very well organized throughout this entire period. And there were a lot of conflicts with, I'm not overstating this to say that they were massacres by the government of the unionized miners to implement this. But at the same time, this was a better reality for laid-off miners than just being unemployed. So once there really wasn't a salaried option for them, they embraced the cooperative system to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where they were in the country.
Now, one of the triggers for my interviewing you, other than my general interest, is that about a month ago, miners were staging a road blockade, that turned violent, and they ended up killing a deputy minister of the Interior from Bolivia, highly placed person in government. It's rare that somebody like that would step into a protest and end up getting killed. That doesn't ordinarily happen, at least in the United States or any Western country. So what was that? What is the current movement all about? What are the blockading miners, what do they want? If my superficial understanding is correct, they want to now associate themselves with companies. Is that correct?
Well, there are actually a number of sparks that cause this roadblock. And I think you have to put in a little bit of context that whenever there is a disagreement between a Bolivian sector of society and the government, roadblocks are usually the first answer. So roadblocks are a pretty common way of putting pressure on the government. But the spark of the protest initially was actually a change to the cooperative law. And this is the law that governs not just mining cooperatives, but all kinds of cooperatives in Bolivia, that would have allowed people employed by cooperatives to unionize. And in the case of mining cooperatives, and what I was just telling you about how some of the cooperatives have these patrones figures who are basically subcontracting their work to others, at very low wages sometimes, these workers would be allowed to unionize against the cooperative structure. So the initial spark was cooperative miners protesting this change to the cooperative law. But it became very quickly apparent that this was just the spark and that there were a whole series of demands that they had more broadly from the government. One of which was the desire to build partnerships with private companies. And this struggle has a pretty long history in Bolivian politics. But the recent iteration of it was around the creation of the new mining law just in 2014, when mining cooperatives were really trying to get it in the law that they should be able to form partnerships with private companies, and they were eventually denied. And this actually goes against pre-existing arrangements because there are some partnerships between cooperatives and private companies that extend back 20 years. So before the current administration in Bolivia and before the current constitution, which was just ratified in 2009. So there was the demand against unionization, there was the demand to form partnerships with private companies. This is also all taking place in the context of falling commodity prices over the last few years. And so there was a demand to have relaxed environmental regulations when prices are low, and there was a demand to have basically relaxed tax rates when mineral prices are low. So that was the spark. But they're all out there protesting. In mid-August, there was a break in the protest when they tried to negotiate. It didn't work. And they reinstated one major roadblock in the town of Penduro, which is just a few hours outside of the city of La Paz, and sent cooperative miners from all over the country, including the part that I work in mostly, which is in the northern part of the department of Potosí, which are mostly tin miners there. And they sent them all to this one roadblock. And basically it was a 48-hour roadblock with mining cooperatives and tons of policemen. And then the deputy vice minister, his name is Iannis, shows up. And this is where reporting gets a little bit murky. Mining cooperatives, So what the news says, what actually happens is that he was kidnapped by a group of cooperative miners, and he was tortured and beaten to death several hours after he'd been kidnapped. So initially they had just kept him in holding, and then they killed him that night. And what the cooperative miners who were there, who I've spoken to, have told me is that he showed up in a way that made them suspicious of his motives. They didn't think he was actually there to negotiate, because he showed up with basically only one guard without a real convoy. They say that he didn't declare his presence right away. There are rumors that he had a lot of money on his person, all of which is to say that they were concerned that he wasn't actually there with the best of intentions that he claimed to be, which is why they detained him. But the actual killing seems to have happened after the miners who were detaining him found out that 2 miners, and it actually later ended up being 4, but they heard about 2, had been killed by bullets fired by police at the roadblock. So their killing him seems to have been an unpremeditated murder that was very much in reaction to the murders of their comrades at the front lines.
All right, so Bolivia fascinates me in so many different ways. So we have to go back to the first part of your answer, what the initial sparks for the blockade were. The cooperative miners were resisting or protesting against a proposal from the government to demand or to allow unionization. Is that right? Is that a fair summary of what you said? So this blows the minds of anybody who just focuses on the U.S.-centered politics. Our standard bubble liberal point of view is that the workers in this country and around the world are getting an unfair deal because they're not allowed to, because unions are being weakened in the Western world. But here we have a case where the government wants to pass a law encouraging unionization, and the miners are resisting it. And I get it, but go into that, please, because it seems to be contradictory to what our typical Western experience here is in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things that have to be clarified historically to understand, I mean, in terms of contemporary politics too, why this would be the case. But one of the important things is, as I mentioned, this division with some cooperative miners getting quite wealthy and having these patrones who employ others and make a lot of money employing others and really don't want this unionization. And then other cooperative miners, like the region that I work in, there are a lot of mining cooperatives that don't have any sort of tertiary employment going on like this. What's interesting is that they still went to the roadblock in support of these other cooperatives who are going to suffer if unionization were given a go. Mm-hmm. And I think this has to do with a desire among the cooperative miners to stick together, to not let the government kind of divide and conquer by passing laws that will, benefit some cooperative miners and not others, so to speak.
Right.
But it is also to do with the really strong tension between the cooperative mining sector as a whole and the unionized sector of mining as a whole, which still exists. It's not nearly as strong as it used to be in Bolivia. Bolivia used to have the strongest miners' union, some of the strongest unions in the world from basically the 1950s through the 1980s. And what still remain of those unions are really disparaging of the cooperative mining sector and see in them just basically a group of small-scale entrepreneurs who are willing to sacrifice nation, nature, and their own bodies and the bodies of their children and their family members and others to get wealthy on the subsoil. And they don't have that strong idealism that went along with the miners' unions and that still exists in the miners' unions that are still strong. And there are a couple of them. So there are a whole bunch of different tensions between different groups of Bolivian society. But the other point that I want to emphasize to understand why this is the government trying to get unionization and the cooperative miners resisting is that the cooperative miners have historically been a pillar of the current government. The President Evo Morales, who came to power in 2006, on a platform of indigenous rights and environmental politics, for some reason that seemed very contradictory to a lot of Bolivians, also had the support of the cooperative miners who, in a sense, flew in the face of all kinds of environmental values that the president was touting. But in this moment, the government is kind of losing popularity for the first time in, it's been about 10 years that the government's been in power. And this year, they lost a referendum that would have allowed the president to run for a fourth term. He's already used up all his constitutional terms. And the loss of that referendum kind of speaks to him kind of losing popularity in general. And I think that getting the cooperative miners on the outside of his government is actually sort of a strategic move from the perspective of President Morales, because cooperative miners are so wildly unpopular among most Bolivians because they're basically seen as thieves of national patrimony. because most Bolivians consider natural resources to be a national wealth that should be shared among all Bolivians and not just accrue to the workers themselves. And cooperative miners pay very little in taxes, and they don't really follow environmental regulations. So from the government's perspective, using them as kind of a scapegoat for environmental and social and economic problems that were not actually created by the mining cooperatives themselves, but rather by the system that allowed these cooperatives to come into being. I think it could be a very strategic move from the government's part.
Yeah, no, this continues to get deeper and deeper and more interesting. A lot of people who look for a way to improve the condition of workers in the world would look to small-scale cooperatives like a Noam Chomsky model, little syndicates. Now, you explained right from the beginning of the interview that the cooperative may not be the best word for these cooperatives.
Yeah.
But leaving that aside, it seems like a model of small-scale groups of semi-autonomous cooperative miners would be a great way to organize society for the benefit of the people doing the work and society as a whole. But you're pointing out how in Bolivia there's these tension between groups in society, and how possibly this is not the ideal arrangement. I don't know what the ideal arrangement is, which brings us to the whole reason we're doing this interview in the first place. I love Bolivia and talking about it, and I presume you do too, but there has to be a larger lesson to this of how the world is going to organize, how society is going to organize, especially workers in the extractive industries, in an industry that continues to suffer from boom-bust cycles, but is absolutely necessary. Why are we talking about Bolivian tin miners? Because we use that tin in our modern electronics here in the United States and all around the world. So this is very important. You pull that cell phone out of your pocket, there's some miner somewhere who extracted the metals that went into that. So what is going on here in Bolivia that we can apply more broadly to the United States, to the current contemporary political situation here in England and other Western countries?
Well, there are so many different directions I could go in to answer that question, but
all of them, please.
I'll do all of them one by one.
Yeah. The
first one that stands out is I think that Bolivian mining cooperatives are a very conservative force within an otherwise pretty left-leaning country. As I mentioned, they don't really follow environmental regulations. They have no industrial security. They're against unionization. There are a number of ways in which you could see these people who I think shouldn't necessarily be blamed for the problems that they create, but are in some very obvious ways perpetuating environmental and social problems. They're a conservative force. And they're similar to miners that you might find in West Virginia or unemployed factory workers that you might find in Northern England who are Trump supporters on one side and voted for Brexit on the other side. And are all three of these groups are products of the failure of kind of an industrial model from the 20th century based entirely on resource extraction in the service of an industrial vision of modernity, more or less. But you're right that mining is going to continue one way or another. Tin is the main ingredient of solder. I shouldn't use the word ingredient. The main compound in solder that is used in basically everything. And even more so now that environmental regulations or health regulations have been passed that limit the amount of lead that can be used in solder. So the percentage of tin has gone up, which is one of the reasons why prices have gone up. So I think that if cooperatives were actually cooperatively organized as opposed to the way they are in Bolivia, where it's just basically a division of labor within the cooperative where there's no wealth redistribution, I think that they, in that case, would provide a model for the way that local residents could negotiate deals with private corporations and the state corporation that would benefit the region in which mining was actually taking place better than what usually happens. But as far as the way they're actually working, in a sense, I think that the mining cooperatives are a lesson against a very facile version of formalization of the small-scale and artisanal mining sector. And this is something that it's an idea that circulates a lot in the development world about how to deal with small-scale and artisanal miners by basically giving them legal rights to the subsoil that they're already working. with the idea being that then they'll start paying taxes, they'll be brought into the formal economy, they'll contribute towards GDP, and so on. But I think the Bolivian case speaks to how just giving those subsoil rights without any sort of capital infusion, without any sort of long-term planning, doesn't necessarily magically result in economic, social, environmental panaceas. In fact, can be quite the opposite.
Yeah, so what we're witnessing in Bolivia has parallels in West Virginia and Kentucky and Northern England, as you say. However, I'm sure you will agree that the answer for Bolivian society is going to be completely different than the answer for coal miners in West Virginia or laid-off industrial workers in Northern England. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you have a solution for global problems in industry in the 21st century? Or...
Oh, gosh, yeah, no, I have several. I have no idea. It's a very complicated question, obviously.
Yeah, and I don't think... Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that, so one of the things that has come out in the aftermath of Llanes being killed here in Bolivia, the Deputy Minister of the Interior, is a series of 5 supreme decrees passed by the Bolivian government just 5 days after he was killed that basically seem to be designed to limit the power of the cooperative mining sector. One of them restates this idea that the workers should be allowed to unionize, and another one actually says that not only can cooperative miners not form alliances with private companies, but the few examples of these partnerships that already exist will be reverted to the state, to state control. So it seems like the state so far is taking a tactic of their strategy to deal with the problems of the mining cooperatives is to completely decimate them, or at least to severely limit their ability to self-govern. And given how many people in Bolivia depend on the cooperative mining system as a form of income, as limited as unstable as it is, this seems to me like absolutely the wrong strategy to take that will basically be throwing thousands of miners under the bus without really addressing the social and economic conditions that led to their creation. As far as a solution goes, I mean, there are a lot of NGOs and universities in Bolivia who try to work with mining cooperatives to get them to develop a more legitimately cooperative internal structure. And there are a handful, maybe 2 or 3 cooperatives in Bolivia who actually do work in a way that we would recognize as cooperative. And in those situations, I think there's a much more realistic chance of some kind of cooperative public-private partnership working successfully. But I think it would really have to be monitored case by case to make sure that the kind of internal divisions of labor, with some people getting a lot of money and other people working for pittances, that have developed in the contemporary cooperatives aren't repeated in subsequent versions of small-scale cooperative syndicates, or an example of small worker ownership.
Now, I don't know what comes, no one knows what comes after Evo. But I sure hope that the U.S. doesn't stick its dirty fingers into the situation again. Some of the issues from the Cold War wave that you talked about earlier in this interview are still around today. The U.S., it's not as intense as it was a few generations ago, but this U.S. is still concerned about leftist movements in South America. Mm-hmm. And if there are... if Bolivia turns in a direction of unionized, increasing union participation for the coal miners, or recreating a large state-owned company, maybe the U.S. is going to object to that, a few decades down the road, and just mess up the situation all over again. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that will also very much depend on what happens with U.S. politics over the next few months.
Sure.
It's hard. I mean, you're right that the leftist wave that took over Latin America starting about 10 years ago with Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, to some extent, Brazil,
Uruguay,
barring recent events, Uruguay, many countries went very far left and then are now starting to swing back towards the right. And in many cases, this is an economic swing that has maintained the same government, For example, there are a lot of critiques of the way that throughout these so-called post-neoliberal or very leftist states in Latin America, the economic base of the country has remained basically unchanged. And all the social programs that these governments have launched have been fueled by rent derived from increased resource extraction. And in the situation we're currently in, of falling commodity prices, this is no longer an economically sustainable way to run leftist programs.
Sure.
And so sometimes the governments haven't changed. Like in Bolivia, we have seen the same president for the last 10 years. In other countries, they have elected more right-wing presidents or leadership bodies. But in general, there seems to be more of a right-wing reaction. So I don't see the U.S. necessarily needing to try to change the political climate in Latin America, given that it already seems to be swinging back to the right on its own.
Good point. So speaking of that, this getting a little more broad than just your focus on the Bolivian mining cooperatives. How have the 10 years of Evo Morales gone? Would you be able to answer, do you think Bolivia is a healthier and more prosperous nation, more set for the future now than it was 10 years ago? Do you have a summation of Evo's term in office?
I think a lot of things have improved under Evo, from kind of questions of rural development, electrification all over the countryside, to the social grant systems, which actually have benefit a lot of people, aimed specifically usually at families, mothers, students, the elderly, and so on. But I think that as time goes on, the government has been disappointing the people who initially supported it. And that could be because the expectations of what Evo and his party were able to do were wildly impossible given the international climate in which Bolivia is situated and the economic climate. But specifically around questions of indigenous rights, just a few years ago, Bolivia, or Evo, lost the support of the highland and lowland indigenous federations after, specifically in 2011, after the government built a highway through what was both an ecologically protected zone and official indigenous territory. And after that break, I think a lot of indigenous people, which were previously a really important pillar of Evo's government, and a lot of leftist academics, sort of the intellectual class in Bolivia, have turned against the government. So I think that the model in which Evo was able to supply many of those social programs was entirely based on resource extraction again, and is not something that's going to be sustainable moving forward, and will probably spell the end of his term in the next few years, because he can't run again, and could be the beginning of a more rightward trajectory in Bolivia. So yes, I guess the short answer is yes, he did a lot to improve Bolivia, but he has also been somewhat, and increasingly so, a disappointment for many Bolivian people.
That seems to be inevitable, and some of it may just be politics. Politics is a tricky game. Even if you do something good for the people, it could be spun into something bad, and then you lose the support of the people, even though you tried your best. And if Bolivia does go in a right-wing direction, I just sure hope that it's not an oppressive, militaristic right-wing direction. Maybe if it's just a right-wing direction where business is more favored, I might be able to live with it. But I certainly don't want to go back to the past political oppression. So I don't think we're in the era of military dictatorship anymore, but I don't even want to get anywhere close to that.
And I don't think it will get close to that. I think to the extent that it goes to the right, it will just be, as you say, more favorable for businesses rather than any sort of dictatorship like what you saw in Bolivia in the 70s. One of the challenges that Evo has had since he came to power was that he has been managing this coalition government that is basically composed of a lot of different interests, including the cocaleros, who are unions of coca growers that Evo Morales actually comes out of himself, and indigenous organizations and cooperative mines and the unions. And there are all kinds of internal tensions between these groups. For example, cocaleros, coca growers, are increasingly encroaching on indigenous territory as they try to find more land to grow coca leaves. And between the cooperative miners and the unionized miners, there have been a number of conflicts in recent years between the two groups trying to get the access to the best mineral ore throughout the country. And those cracks, now that the economic situation is more precarious, those political cracks between different groups are becoming more apparent. And the impossibility of pleasing all of them is also becoming more apparent. So I think that's, in a sense, his success was predicated on economic stability. And without that, these political tensions become a bigger problem.
Sure. All right, well, look, I lived in Bolivia about, now it's been 15 years. I spent about a year in Oruro and Cochabamba, and I've been looking for all this time for someone to be my inside source on what's going on, and I think I finally found it.
Well, I'm glad I can be that, and I'm surprised you spent time in Oruro. I go through there a lot, and there aren't many foreigners hanging around there.
No, I was working on an environmental project at the primary mine there. And,
that makes sense.
Yeah, so, and I loved it. There's not a single tree in the whole city, but somehow I still loved it because everything that has to do with Bolivia I enjoy. But that brings us to a slightly lighter subject. You have the academic career that I wish I had had the foresight to go into myself. So can you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to studying the Bolivian mining cooperatives as your PhD program?
Sure. I'm Canadian. I guess I should say that up front. I don't just to share my national allegiances. Mm-hmm. But I was doing my master's at UBC in Vancouver, studying water politics in Cochabamba, which is obviously, well, for anyone who knows about Latin American water politics, Cochabamba was a really classic example of Bolivians rejecting a private water company that had taken over their municipal supply. And in the aftermath of that, there was still a lot of community water supply running. There still is in the southern part of Cochabamba. And I was working there on small-scale water provision, but I was also studying water law. And it became pretty apparent to me in conversation with a lot of people working on water law that you couldn't understand the legal situation around water without understanding mining. And then I started digging around into mining in Bolivia and realized how huge and how bizarre this cooperative mining sector really is, and how much political pressure they really exert on the government. They don't have much economic power in Bolivia relative to state and private companies, but they have a lot of political power. And so when I decided to come back for my PhD, because I, like you, loved Bolivia and wanted to come back, I thought this would be an interesting avenue to explore.
Okay, sure, but you skipped the critical step. How did you get into Cochabamba to be observing and studying the water issue first?
Well, I've been working in Latin America for, probably since I started undergrad, so almost a couple of decades now. And I was going to do my master's work in northern Mexico about water, which is where I had already spent some time in Mexico, mostly southern Mexico. But this was 2010, and the war on drugs was creating such an unstable political situation that it was suggested to me that if I showed up and started interviewing people about water, it would be assumed that I was a journalist, and then not only would I be in danger, but everyone I interviewed would also be in danger. And so in a moment in my master's program, not knowing what to do, knowing why I wanted to work in Latin America studying water, I was put in contact with the agronomy department in the Universidad de San Simón, which is the university in Cochabamba, and we set up a project there. So in a way, I ended up in Bolivia almost through fluke, but have really decided to make it my second or third home, so to speak, because it's a great country to be and very exciting politically all the time.
Yeah, it certainly is. And boy, so you've been in academia already for nearly 2 decades, you say?
Well, that could be
fortunate.
an exaggeration. Yeah, that's quite an exaggeration. Let's see, 12 years.
Okay, so well short of 20. All right, but that makes a little more sense. But
Yeah.
I hope it continues for you. I don't know. Is academia your plan for the rest of your career, or do you end up wanting to work at an NGO, or you aren't thinking about that so much?
I would like to stay in academia. As I'm sure you're aware, it's a difficult career to forge with not a lot of job creation happening anywhere in North America. So to the extent that it's possible, I'm hoping to stay in academia for sure. But we'll see what happens in the long run.
But that's why I emphasized somewhere in the middle of this interview the broader lessons of the Bolivian mining cooperatives, because academia should have some, every once in a while, connection to the real world. And there really is a connection, a relevance of the Bolivian mining situation to what's happening in contemporary politics in our country here in the US, and as we talk about in England and others. So I think that's a hook that, well, I don't know if it will impress the faculty that has to make hiring decisions, but it will certainly impress the media, and it will give a reason, give some sort of reason for your work, some sort of rationale, some sort of meaning. And
well, I hope so.
Yeah, and certainly enough for me to want to reach out to you next time there's some incident in Bolivia that we need to talk about. So I hope you don't mind if we stay in contact on that.
Yeah, please do reach out. I'd be happy. I'm always happy to talk about Bolivia. The problem is just sometimes I talk for too long.
No, it helped me a lot. I didn't have everything lined up in quite the way I asked you, but you did, and your answers covered everything that we needed to talk about. I hope the audience has found this somewhat enlightening. We're probably going to come back to this subject, at least I am, on TYT interviews. So I want to thank you, Andrea Marston, geography student at University of California-Berkeley, studying for a PhD, coming to us from La Paz, Bolivia. Thanks for being on with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave.
Glad to do it here with you, and we'll be in touch. And thank you to the audience for watching this episode of TYT Interviews.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.